People who have unalive another person, accidentally or on purpose, what happened? Story 1. In 1995, I was living with my mother, who struggled with substance abuse, and my sister, who was 4 years older than me. My mom worked at a bar, and as a 7-year-old, I spent much of my time there. We had a small home, more like a converted shed on a lot. My mom became close with one of the patrons, who also had issues with alcohol and drugs. One day, she ended things with him, and after that, he kept coming over, threatening her. A few days later, she got a phone call from him. I'm not sure what was said, but she quickly tried to get us into the back room where we kept our clothes, attempting to hide us under them. I panicked and tried to leave the house. As I reached the front door, a truck pulled in. I stopped and heard him get out, shouting for my mother. He tried to open the door but failed at first. I was only a few feet away when he fired a shot at the door. Terrified, I jumped onto the couch beside the door and grabbed my t-ball bat. He kept kicking until the door opened. As he stepped inside, I struck him in the forehead, and he immediately collapsed. I screamed, and my mom came out with my sister. We left together and called the police from the bar. That same night, I went to live with my father permanently, as my mother had outstanding arrest warrants. I didn't find out until I was about 16 that the man had passed away in the hospital due to a combination of his injuries and severe alcohol poisoning. I don't carry guilt over it. Story 2. I'm 22 now, but this happened when I was 19, and I still think about it often. Since I was very young, around 4 or 5, my dad had kidney problems. He was on dialysis for a while, received a transplant that lasted several years, and then went back to dialysis for another 10 years. Eventually, he decided the pain was too much and chose to stop treatment. He came home with the plan to spend his remaining days surrounded by loved ones. 2 weeks passed, which is a long time to survive without dialysis. His health declined rapidly. He was showing all the symptoms of advanced uremic poisoning, and we knew the end was near. Every breath was a struggle, and it was the hardest thing I have ever witnessed. Hospice had provided medication for his comfort, including concentrated liquid morphine. I couldn't stand to see him suffer any longer, so I administered 2 doses under his tongue. I knew his body was already shutting down from illness, but I also know the amount I gave likely hastened the end. I believe it was the right choice for his comfort, but living with the knowledge that I may have ended my father's life is not easy. Story 3. One night I was hosting a party in my house, which was still partially under construction. A few friends and I were relaxing with some drinks. The top floor wasn't built yet, only a staircase and a small platform at the top existed. My best friend, who had been helping with the construction and knew the house well, later told me he went upstairs to look at the moon and stars. He fell. There was nothing solid to stand on, and he stepped into the dark. He survived but broke his back and became paralyzed. I cried for days, but when I saw him in the hospital, I stayed strong and talked about all the things we could still do together. He had a wife and 2 children, and eventually he was released from the hospital. I carried him on my back often and felt immense guilt over what had happened. One night he became ill and returned to the hospital for tests. Years later, I learned that friends had brought him enough substances to end his life, without telling me because they knew I would try to stop him. He passed away there, leaving no note. I have a photo of him smiling in his hospital bed just 2 days before. Now I know that inside he had already given up. I still haven't fully forgiven myself. I could have boarded up the doorway. Even now, with the top floor finished, I feel uneasy walking through it. I miss him deeply, and I'm grateful his son and I share a close bond. Please be mindful of your surroundings and look out for your friends, especially when drinking. Story 4. When I was a medical student on my surgery rotation, I was in the operating room with only the attending surgeon. The residents were busy, so the attending said, "Fine, I'll do it with just the med student." The procedure was a gastric tube placement for a patient unable to eat. At the institution where I work now, these are often done under laparoscopic guidance for safety. The attending inserted a scope into the patient's esophagus, and I had a large needle to guide toward the scope. When the light from the scope was visible through the skin, I pressed on it, saw the indentation on the screen, and thought I was in the right spot. I inserted the needle, but it didn't appear on the screen. I pulled back, tried again. Still nothing. The attending grew frustrated and told me to push it deeper. I hesitated but eventually did. The resident arrived and tried as well, but also couldn't visualize it at first. Eventually, they succeeded, and the procedure was completed. When I returned after a day off, I learned the patient had died from internal bleeding overnight. One or more of the needle attempts had damaged abdominal vessels. I carried guilt for the rest of medical school and was hesitant the first time I did that procedure as a resident. I now always trust my instincts and explain to patients that low risk does not mean no risk. Story 5. When I was a truck driver in training, I became part of a tragic event. We were driving late at night on US 277 between Piedras Negras and Del Rio. The road was flat, straight, and quiet. I was at the wheel while my mentor, also awake, was in the sleeper berth talking to me. Far ahead, I saw headlights and thought nothing of it. As they approached, it looked like they began turning left, but there was no road there. Suddenly, they drove straight toward us. It was a pickup truck, and in the split second I saw the driver, I realized there was no way to avoid it. I braked hard, but the collision split the truck in two. I suffered a broken wrist. My mentor had broken ribs and a bruised liver. When we checked the scene, I saw part of the driver's boot and realized the severity of the impact. It was later revealed he had taken his own life. He left behind a young wife and 2 daughters. I know I couldn't have prevented it, but the memory still weighs heavily on me. Story 6. When I was 5 years old, my family was living on a small street inside an army base. My best friend lived 2 houses down, and we would often team up to play pranks on our younger sisters. Mine was 4, his was 3. One day we thought it would be funny to climb onto the carport, call for them to come find us, and then splash them with water from above. It worked as planned with my sister, but his sister ran into the street and was struck by a moving truck. He screamed and I jumped down, trying to wake her up. Family members came rushing outside to find me kneeling there, desperately shaking her. My family pulled me away as the ambulance arrived and took her away. My friend moved within weeks, and I didn't play outside until we moved away less than a year later. For years afterward, I would drive by that street just to cry. I still think about it from time to time, but I've never sought professional help. Even during my time in the military when I was responsible for others, nothing affected me the same way. Story 7. 3 years ago, my grandmother died in an accident, and my father still partly blames himself. She often stayed at my uncle's house because she loved babysitting my young cousin, who was about 2 years old. My dad was visiting his brother that weekend and had asked me to come along, but I wasn't feeling well. That Saturday evening, my grandmother kissed my dad and uncle goodnight and went down to the guest room in the cellar. My dad and uncle stayed upstairs talking, watching TV, and having a couple of beers. Suddenly, they heard a loud thump from the basement. When my dad opened the door, he saw that the safety gate at the top of the stairs, meant to keep my cousin and the dogs out, was broken. The stairs were steep and spiraled downwards. A few steps down, he saw my grandmother lying on the concrete floor, unresponsive, with a serious head injury. She still had a pulse and was breathing, but barely. They called an ambulance, and she was rushed to the hospital. Later that night, my father called me several times, but I ignored the first 2 calls, thinking he just wanted to talk. When I finally answered, I heard him sobbing and saying, "Grandma's dead." At the hospital, the doctor told us she was brain dead and could not breathe without a respirator. Surgery was possible, but even if successful, she would never recover consciousness. Knowing her wishes, my father and uncle made the painful decision to let her go. We said our goodbyes, and I saw my father more emotional than ever before. He later told me he believed she had been trying to go upstairs when she fell, possibly reaching for the dog gate when it gave way. The doctors said she likely passed the moment she hit the floor. He also admitted he had missed a call from her just minutes before it happened, and he still wonders what she needed. That unanswered question still weighs on him. Story 8. This didn't happen to me, but to my father when he was 11 years old. He had a best friend, whom I'll call Joseph. My dad grew up in Mexico, and most of his friends were very poor, while his family was better off because my grandmother was a nurse. He noticed Joseph never brought lunch to school, so he started bringing him one every day. Months went by, and then one day Joseph didn't show up to school. Days passed with no sign of him. My dad eventually went to his house, only to find out Joseph had gone missing. The police were involved, but my grandparents didn't tell my father many details. The next day, walking home from school, My dad took a different route for no clear reason and passed by an abandoned building. He felt an overwhelming urge to go inside, but got scared and ran home. The following day, my grandparents told him Joseph had been found in that very building. It turned out he had been kidnapped and held there. The man responsible was caught weeks later, and it was revealed that Joseph was still alive in that building just hours before my dad had walked by. My father still carries the sadness of knowing he might have been able to help, though he's tried to forgive his younger self. Story 9. When I was 13, living in Norway, I loved climbing trees with my friends. The tallest trees were near the river at the bottom of town, so one Friday we went there with backpacks full of snacks and drinks, planning to stay until dark. My friend's younger brother, who was 11, came along, eager to be part of what the big kids were doing. He wasn't as experienced at climbing, but he didn't want to miss out. I reached our usual spot first and hung my backpack on a branch, then asked him to pass me his so it would be easier for him to climb. As he reached up, his foot slipped, and he didn't have the strength to hold himself. He fell all the way down, landing on jagged rocks in the river below. He was killed instantly. My friend and I climbed down as fast as we could, but it was too late. He had only wanted to join us. I've often thought that if I hadn't asked for his backpack, things might have been different. My childhood friend hasn't spoken to me or been in the same room with me since, and it's been over 10 years. People tell me it wasn't my fault, but the guilt remains. If there's one lesson from that day, it's that anything can happen, anywhere, at any time. So tell the people you love that you love them while you can. Story 10. When I was 18, I went to a party with my brother-in-law. We had both been drinking, but when it was time to go home, I decided to drive. My reasoning was that if he were caught driving under the influence, his career as a firefighter would be over, and my sister and nephew would be left without support. It was poor judgment on my part. As we crossed a highway, we were hit from the side by a truck going over 65 miles per hour. My brother-in-law died instantly, and I woke up in the ER hours later to the devastating news. It felt like the weight of the world had crushed me. I cried for hours and thought about ending my life every day while in the ICU. 9 years have passed, and although some days are better than others, it's always in the back of my mind. My life has struggled to regain stability since. I served time in prison for my actions, attempted college several times but dropped out, and fought various addictions. I've struggled to maintain close relationships, but I no longer think about taking my own life. I can't. I already took his, and it would dishonor his memory to take my own. I want to live a better life in his honor. For now, waking up each day is what I can promise, and I hold on to the hope that one day I can do more. Story 11. When I was 9 years old, my brother was 11, and we were close, until we moved to a new state. He wanted his own friends, and I felt left out. He had just become best friends with a boy named Ricky, who was well-liked and successful both in school and sports. One day they decided to ride their bikes to the local reservoir, a popular hangout spot. My brother told me to stay behind, but I followed them anyway. They left their bikes and went to explore a dangerous overpass near a waterfall and soon found me trailing behind. Annoyed, my brother accepted that I was there since we were too far in to turn back. The rocks were slick and I kept slipping. We decided to wash the mud off our shoes, but Ricky thought it was too dangerous for me, so he offered to do it for me. In an instant, he was gone, swept away. His body was found days later. The town blamed my brother, labeling him cruelly. I've lived with the guilt of taking away his closest friend and his chance at happiness. We're still close, but that day changed us forever. If I had listened, things might have been different. Story 12. I started Taekwondo at 4 years old, inspired by martial arts films. I trained for years, competed nationally, and won many trophies. At 14, during a domestic competition, I landed a spinning hook kick, something I had done countless times before. My opponent fell and didn't get back up. Paramedics rushed in, removed his gear, and began CPR, but he was pronounced dead at the hospital. We had full protective equipment, but my heel had struck the side of his head, causing fatal head trauma. I never practiced Taekwondo again. I gave my gear away, withdrew from others, and faced cruelty at school where I was called a murderer. Years later, my father died in a car accident caused by a tired driver. That tragedy helped me understand that accidents happen. With inheritance money, I traveled for nearly 2 years, which helped me regain confidence. I later returned home, finished college, and began a career. I still send flowers and a card to my opponent's family each year on the competition's anniversary, and I've met with them. They were kind, which helped me heal. To anyone in a similar situation, remember, if it was truly an accident, there can still be light at the end of the tunnel. Story 13. I work armed security for a campus police department. In my state, I'm considered non-sworn law enforcement with many of the same authorities as a police officer. One evening, a man walked in with a cut along the side of his face, saying someone had stolen his car and injured him. I called for a police officer and medics, but as we waited, I offered to get a trauma kit from my patrol car. As I headed for the door, I noticed he was lagging behind and asked him to wait. That's when he said, "Officer, I have a problem." Before I could react, he pulled out a mini sledgehammer. I backed up, drew my pistol, and tripped over furniture, ending up on the ground in a corner. He charged at me. For a moment, I felt fear and helplessness, but it quickly turned into rage. I rushed him, grabbed his wrist, and forced him to drop the hammer. We grappled, and at one point, he gained full mount over me. I managed to push him away, draw my gun, and pull the trigger, but it misfired. I racked the slide and fired twice. He said, "All right, I'm done," and collapsed. Backup arrived as I kept my weapon trained on him. He died before medics could stabilize him. From the initial call to the shots fired, only about 3 minutes had passed, with the fight itself lasting less than 2. Story 14. 8 years ago, my wife was involved in a 2-car accident. She hit another vehicle on the driver's side, but the passenger in that car was not wearing a seatbelt and was ejected from the vehicle, passing away at the scene. Neither driver could remember who had the green light, so both received tickets and court dates, and both lost their licenses. For my wife, the weight of knowing that a man had lost his wife and that he was still punished afterward was almost unbearable. She would cry, recalling the moments when she had to hold her own children back from running toward her in the aftermath. She doesn't talk about it anymore. We weren't together at the time, but we began dating soon after. Some days were harder for her than others. She felt guilty for taking a mother from her children and the love of someone's life. She wished it had been her instead. I would hold her and remind her she was loved, telling her sometimes tragedies happen without reason. Her depression improved after we had our first child. Bringing life into the world seemed to help her heal, but it's something she will carry forever, and it's something I will help her carry for the rest of her life. Always wear a seatbelt. That loss might have been prevented. Story 15. A couple of years ago, I was in line at a convenience store when a man in a hoodie came in, pulled a gun, and demanded money from the cashier. The store was crowded, so I stayed still, thinking it was best if he just took the cash and left. But then he turned his gun toward a girl who looked to be about 13. She had been silent the whole time, doing nothing to provoke him. I didn't know if he would actually hurt her, but I couldn't take the chance. When he looked away, I drew my firearm and shot him 4 times. He collapsed instantly. I scanned the store to ensure there were no other threats, then holstered my weapon and began first aid. I kept him alive until the police arrived, at which point I was cuffed while they confirmed witness accounts. I was quickly released when it was clear I acted in the girl's defense. He didn't survive. He was 23 and died over $433. I still wonder if I did the right thing. But when he turned toward that girl, I had a chilling feeling he was about to escalate. Nobody should die over money, but in that moment, I couldn't risk him firing. Story 16. Years ago, I was living in a shared house. One rainy evening, it was my turn to take the bins out. The trash can was already full, so I set the bags next to it in the back alley. As I passed through the gate, one of the bags caught on the latch, ripping slightly and spilling some garbage. I decided I'd clean it up in the morning. I overslept, and by midday I went outside to find trash scattered everywhere, likely from seagulls. I cleaned it up and went back inside, only for my friend to tell me the elderly neighbor had an accident. That morning she had gone out to clean up the mess herself, slipped and hit her head. She later suffered a severe medical episode and passed away. I don't know the exact medical cause, but I've always felt guilty for not cleaning up the spill right away. Now, whenever I notice something that could cause harm to someone, I feel compelled to deal with it immediately. Story 17. I work as a psychiatric nurse, and when I was in the psych ER, we had a patient who seemed like he was holding his life together. Employed, owned a home, but he had no surviving family. His wife and daughter had died in a car accident 6 months earlier, and he had also shot and killed a burglar at his job as a security guard. He wanted help, so we developed a crisis plan. He denied being suicidal when discharged. I remember watching him walk to his car after we went over his paperwork. A month later, I learned he had ended his life. His original firearm had been taken as evidence after the burglary incident, but he had found another. Sometimes the people most likely to take their own lives don't show it openly. I still think about what subtle signs we might have missed. It feels like I failed him. Story 18. When I was 19, I spent the day with my girlfriend until late afternoon. She was going to a friend's house to swim, and her mother asked her to take a bag of trash to the dump. I followed her there, tossed the bag into the dumpster, banged on the truck bed to signal she could go, and said goodbye. I realized later I hadn't said I love you like usual, so I sent a text. She didn't reply, but I assumed she hadn't heard it over the truck's loud exhaust. When I got home, her mother called in a panic. There had been an accident. My girlfriend was alive, but being airlifted to a hospital in Richmond, Virginia. By the time we arrived, a doctor met us and said she hadn't made it. I was in shock, and grief consumed me for weeks. I lost 40 pounds in a month and shut myself off from everyone. I blamed myself, believing my text distracted her. Years later, I found a newspaper clipping saying she had swerved to avoid a dog, overcorrected, and flipped the truck. Knowing my text wasn't the cause lifted a heavy burden. I eventually met someone new, got married, and had 2 beautiful children. Time doesn't erase the pain, but it taught me I could live again. Story 19. In August 2016, my wife and I welcomed our son Joel. He was the most beautiful and precious thing that had ever happened to me. We were thrilled to bring him home and spent the first 3 days trading off sleep every few hours. One day we ran some errands, went to Walmart, and then stopped at Denny's for a meal. Joel slept almost the entire time until our food arrived. My wife covered herself and began to breastfeed him, everything seeming perfectly normal. When he was finished, she began placing him in the stroller, and that's when we noticed he was pale and limp. In an instant, I went into firefighter mode from my years of training and started CPR on my 3-day-old son. We got him to the hospital, and after a transfer to Cook Children's Hospital in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, we received the worst news a parent can hear. SIDS can happen anywhere, not just in a crib. It had happened while Joel was feeding. I kept his heart beating, but he had gone too long without oxygen. He could no longer breathe without machines, and his brain was too damaged. After 3 more days in the hospital, my wife and I made the heart-wrenching decision to withdraw life support. His heart kept beating for 16 more hours, each one weighing heavily on us, making us question if we had made the right decision. Eventually, we let him go. I know from my medical knowledge that we made the only choice we could, but the emotional part of me still struggles to accept it. SIDS is unpredictable. You can do everything right and still lose your child. The greatest honor you can give them is to keep living in a way they would be proud of. That's what has kept me going, even as our lives fell apart. I share this so anyone going through something similar knows it's not your fault and you're not alone. Story 20. My oldest brother suffered from kidney failure after a lifetime of drug use. Years earlier, he had been in a drunk driving accident that left him paralyzed from the waist down. Even with his struggles, he was an amazing brother, intelligent, articulate, and wise. We had a special bond. When he began dialysis, he told me he feared it would be the beginning of the end for him. I refused to give him one of my kidneys, as I knew he would likely destroy it with his lifestyle. My other brothers felt the same. After a year, he called to say he wasn't going back to dialysis. He asked me to bring him his favorite foods, especially a hot pastrami sandwich from a small place we loved. I knew these foods, along with the alcohol and other things he requested, would hasten his death, but I complied. We said our tearful goodbyes. A day later, he slipped into a coma and passed away. He made me promise not to tell our other brothers, and I kept that promise, denying them a chance to say goodbye. I live with the guilt of that decision every day. I tell myself I respected his wishes, but it's hard knowing I could have forced him into treatment or reported what he was doing. Still, I have to believe it's what he wanted. Story 21. When I was 10, My dad took me to a shooting range for the first time. I hadn't even known he owned a gun. We filled out some paperwork and drove to our spot. He gave me a long lecture on gun safety, and I was thrilled to finally try it. We shot at bits of trash downrange. He set an empty soda bottle on a log, and I managed to shoot the cap clean off. He smiled and praised me. In my excitement, I forgot everything about keeping the gun pointed safely. I turned toward him with the gun in my hand, and it discharged, hitting him near the shoulder. I'll never forget the sight of the blood on his white shirt. He fell, and I screamed for help. A nearby family rushed over. While the parents applied pressure to the wound and called 911, their teenage son tried to comfort me. Because we were in a remote area, an ambulance couldn't reach us in time, so a helicopter was dispatched. It took about 30 minutes to arrive. They loaded my dad onto the helicopter, and an officer drove me to the police station. I sat alone for hours answering questions, including why I would want to hurt my father. Finally, my uncle came to take me home. When we arrived, the house was full of crying relatives. My mom came to me and said the doctors had done all they could, but my father had not survived. Story 22. Growing up, I had family struggles. My mother was removed from our home by social services after neighbors reported suspected child abuse. Looking back, I realized she was likely not in a position to care for me. She struggled with alcoholism, but I don't believe she was abusive. As a kid, I was difficult to handle and often refused to listen. After the intervention, I had supervised visits with her every 2 weeks. If she was under the influence, I had to leave. Many times I would find her hiding an open beer or slipping outside for a quick drink. This happened in nearly half of our visits. This went on from when I was about 12 until I turned 16. At that point, the court allowed me to decide whether to continue visitation. I called her one evening and told her I wouldn't visit anymore, that her drinking was hurting me and she needed to stop. A month later, she invited me to go to Hawaii with her, a place she loved from her younger days. I declined, but she went anyway. A few weeks after she returned, she passed away. My aunt never told me how, but I suspect it may have been suicide. I was in 11th grade, and my grades suffered badly afterward. It took years to recover and move forward. I don't blame myself. Her drinking was damaging my well-being, but I know my decision likely impacted her deeply. Her side of the family stopped speaking to me, and I haven't been invited to family gatherings since. It's been over 10 years now, and I'm in the final semester of my engineering degree. It was a long road, but I eventually found my footing. Story 23. 2 years ago, when I was 17, I hosted a small gathering at my girlfriend's house. She lived in a split home. She and her mother on one side, her grandmother and cousin on the other. There were about 6 of us drinking until around 3 a.m., after which I fell asleep. I woke up to screaming, and the room was filled with black smoke. I couldn't see or breathe, but I knew the layout of her room. I started pushing my friends toward the door and down to the first floor, making sure I was the last one out. Once outside, I saw the whole house was engulfed in flames. People were panicking, and I was the only one thinking clearly. I borrowed a phone and called 911. When the operator asked if everyone was out, I looked around and realized her grandmother wasn't there. I dropped the phone, grabbed her cousin, and we ran back inside. I searched the first floor while he went upstairs. The smoke became unbearable, and I had to get out. Outside, I heard him yelling from the back. He was trapped in a second-floor bedroom and had smashed a window. I told him he had to jump or he'd die, but he refused, saying, "My grandma's still in here, man. I can't leave her." He went back inside and no one saw him again. They believe he died from smoke inhalation before the fire reached him. His grandmother didn't make it either. In our small town, everyone knew, and it weighed heavily on my girlfriend. We drifted apart after a few months, but his last words still haunt me. I replay that night over and over, wishing I had found a way to convince him to leave. Story 24. When I was younger, we lived in a rough trailer park. My mother was friendly with everyone, including a couple next door who used drugs. They often had their dealer over, and though he wasn't unpleasant toward me, things took a dark turn one night. My mother went over to drink with them. She didn't use drugs, but later that night, I heard yelling. Concerned, I went over and walked into chaos. The couple sat dazed on the couch while the dealer had his hands around my mother's neck. His back was to me. I knew the couple kept a baseball bat near the door, So I grabbed it and swung with all my strength. He collapsed instantly. I didn't know if he was dead at that moment, but when the police and paramedics arrived, it was confirmed. I felt nothing. If anything, that was the day I became numb. Since then, I've struggled to express emotions naturally, even in happy moments. We never spoke about it again. It was treated as if it had never happened. Now, serving in the military, I hear people say that taking a life changes you. For me, that moment already had. Story 25. During my time on convoy security duty in Iraq, we had a regular route we called the parade route. We'd often bring candy and small gifts for the kids in the villages we passed, and over time they would come out to wave and give us water. We ran that route 3 times a week, always at the same time. One day, orders came down to change our loadout and add more security vehicles. I was assigned to drive the lead security vehicle. We moved out late in the day instead of in the morning. Passing through the villages, fewer locals came out. At our last stop, there was only a man and his teenage son working on an old truck. The boy walked out into the road, waving as we approached. I slowed slightly, but Brass ordered me to maintain speed and interval. I tried to move around him, but he kept stepping in front of us. Brass ordered a warning shot into the air, which startled him and his father. As I closed in, I slowed again, but the command was firm. Don't stop this convoy for anything. At the last moment, I swerved, but he stepped the same way, and I hit him at about 40 kilometers per hour, just yards from his father. Later, I learned 13 of the 18 vehicles in our convoy ran over him. The medics who stopped said the father wanted no one near them. I will never forget locking eyes with that boy in the last second, or the pleading look in his father's eyes. Even after more than a decade, those moments replay in slow motion. Story 26. When I was 11, I accidentally shot my best friend, who was 13. She had been planning to end her life due to serious family problems, including abuse and neglect. I tried to take the gun from her, but in the struggle, it went off. She survived but lost her ear, her entire left cheek, and most of her lower jaw. Her little brother found us first, then her parents. Her mother attacked me in anger, leaving me with facial injuries that required surgery. Court proceedings dragged on for 3 years. I was found not guilty, but her parents were later convicted of abuse and neglect, and her father of assault. Because of my own difficult home life, I spent time in a mental health facility until my parents pulled me out for appearance's sake. I'm 19 now in therapy and on medication. The trauma never fully goes away. Loud noises, the smell of gunpowder, or hearing a child scream can trigger panic attacks. It's hard to put into words how much it has shaped my life. My advice is this: if you ever find yourself trying to help someone in crisis, don't carry the blame if things go wrong. Even if the law says it's your fault, that doesn't mean it truly is. Story 27. In 9th grade, I struggled with anger and was frequently suspended for fighting. There was one student, much larger than me, who seemed determined to make my life miserable. I reported him to school staff many times, but nothing changed. One day, just before class, he put me in a chokehold. I broke free, grabbed his head, and slammed it into a locker with all my strength. He fell unconscious. A teacher ran over as I walked to the principal's office, already fearing the worst. The next day, I learned he had died from a brain injury caused by blunt force trauma. It was ruled self-defense, and I faced no charges, but it has followed me ever since. I live in a small town, and nearly everyone knows what happened. I've been called names in public, had graffiti sprayed on my driveway, and even had my photo posted around town. Simple tasks like grocery shopping or walking through the mall mean enduring stares and whispered comments. Though I know I acted to protect myself, being known as the killer who got away is something I will carry for the rest of my life. Story 28. When I was about 9 or 10, my dad went through his second divorce. To keep the house, he started renting out rooms. One tenant, Ellen, became an important figure in my life. Our dogs were inseparable, and she once made the best tinfoil armor for Nerf wars. Over time, I learned more about her. Her mother had died by suicide after Hurricane Katrina destroyed their home, which was why she was living with us. Despite her past, Ellen always seemed upbeat. My dad worked nights, so she would often take me for walks or watch TV with me, almost like a parent on weekends. But beneath the surface, there were problems I didn't see until it was too late. Eventually, she and my dad fell into a destructive, codependent relationship. His drinking escalated to extreme levels, and she developed a pill habit mixed with alcohol. As their addictions worsened, my dad became more aggressive, even physically with me, and Ellen seemed to give up on herself. I once had to pull him off her after he made unwanted advances while drunk. Looking back, there were countless red flags. One night, the dogs barked nonstop. Ellen always left her door open for them, but that night it was closed. I ignored it, putting on headphones instead of checking. When my dad came home from work in the morning, he found her. She had died from a mix of pills and alcohol, ultimately from asphyxiation. It's been 4 years and my dad is now sober, but I still feel like I failed her. There were so many moments I could have acted, and I didn't. That guilt hasn't faded. Story 29. When I was 16, I started dating a guy from school. Early on, I noticed red flags and planned to end things. He had arrogant, wealthy friends, and I didn't want to be around them. One night, returning from a late beach trip, I sat in the passenger seat of his truck, while one of his friends rode in the back. He was blasting music, showing off his illegal headlights to his friend, and not watching the poorly lit highway. Just as I was about to warn him, I saw a face illuminated by the lights, and then hit the windshield. I panicked, telling him what happened, but he and his friend insisted it was probably just debris. When I broke down crying, he pulled over, and I ran along the freeway looking for the person. Another driver stopped and put their hazard lights on to protect the body. In their headlights, I saw the victim, a pool of blood around his head, a shoe, a torn backpack, and broken bottles. People began getting out of their cars, and some assumed I was responsible. The noise from sirens and traffic was overwhelming. I ran back to the truck, where my boyfriend and his friend were laughing. I still don't understand their reaction. The police arrived, and even the officer questioned their lack of concern, scolding them for it. Later, instead of taking me home, he insisted on meeting more friends, who also joked about the situation. They made cruel remarks and suggested we go out to eat. After arguing, he finally took me home. I never learned if the man survived, but given the amount of blood, I doubt it. The boy harassed me for months to speak to his insurance company, but I refused. It took years for me to get my driver's license, and I'm still an extremely cautious driver, always fearing I might face something like that again. Story 30. One night, 2 of my best friends and I went out to a strip club. We had been drinking before we left while we were there and continued when we got back to my house. One friend went home while the other stayed to finish watching a movie. At one point, I went into my bedroom to get an Alka-Seltzer. My friend followed me, telling me a story as we walked. In the room, he noticed my handgun on the floor next to the bed and wanted to look at it. In my drunken state, I picked it up and unloaded it incorrectly, racking the slide first, then dropping the magazine, leaving a round still in the chamber. The pistol had a decocking lever, but I kept my finger inside the trigger guard while using it. My hand flexed, and I accidentally fired. The bullet struck the back of his head and lodged behind his right eye. I don't clearly remember him at that moment, only the thought. The gun went off. I dropped the weapon, ran to get the phone, called 911, and performed CPR, trying to stop the bleeding. Within minutes, he was gone. Paramedics arrived 30 minutes later. I was arrested 3 months later and charged with second-degree murder. A year after, I pled guilty to negligent homicide and served 4 years in prison, followed by a year on parole. This happened 15 years ago, and I can still remember the metallic smell of blood. I dream about it less now, but I often dream about prison. Story 31. A few months ago, I lost my father. One morning, he woke me up saying his heart was hurting and asking if I could take him to the hospital. On the way there, he said he was starting to feel better and asked me to drive around a bit. When the pain seemed to ease more, I asked if he wanted to go home, and he agreed. We were right next to the hospital, but I turned back. About 30 minutes after we got home, he came to my room saying the pain had returned and that he needed to go to the hospital. I wanted to quickly finish what I was doing before taking him, but a few minutes later, he had already driven himself there. I didn't have a phone or car to follow. That night, I found out he had passed away shortly after arriving. Even though I know I can't change it now, the guilt and regret have been overwhelming. I can't stop thinking that if I had just taken him to the hospital right away, he might still be here. Story 32. A couple of years ago, One of my friends was going through a rebellious phase that included petty crime. His uncle, a career criminal, taught him how to steal cars. They were bad at it and often broke more cars than they managed to take, but eventually he got one. Wanting to protect him, I helped disguise the car to make it look less suspicious, thinking it was just a one-time joyride. After a few days, I found the keys in the couch and considered hiding them so he wouldn't get into trouble. But I convinced myself that keeping them from him might push him toward doing something worse, so I gave them back. That night, he went out partying. Later, his uncles came to tell me he had been in a serious accident. He was brain dead, and a girl he had offered a ride to, a girl he barely knew, was killed instantly. His mother forgave me and even thanked me for helping her piece together what happened. But I can't help thinking that if I had kept those keys, things might have been different. Story 33. When I was in middle school, my brother moved back in with our parents to get clean from drug addiction. He made great progress. He got a good job and started spending more time with his son. But he still sometimes spent time with people involved with drugs, and my parents couldn't completely prevent it. The night before his 32nd birthday, my sister had a minor car accident after falling asleep at the wheel. The next night, we celebrated his birthday with his favorite German chocolate cake. After dinner, he said he was going out with friends from work and asked to borrow my dad's new truck. My dad agreed. For some reason, I had a sudden thought, here comes another car wreck. I didn't say anything. Later that night, my aunt woke me up and brought me downstairs, where my parents told me my brother had died in a car crash. For years, I've wondered if saying something could have changed his fate, even if it just made him more cautious. That thought still lingers every time I think about him. Story 34. In February 2010, during my second deployment to Afghanistan, I received a call from the American Red Cross informing me that my father had suffered a heart attack and was in the hospital. They said I needed to come home immediately. After 36 hours of nonstop travel, I arrived at the hospital only to be told by the doctor that, due to my father's alcoholism, there was little hope he would ever wake up again. I spent the next 48 hours wrestling with the decision to take him off life support. It wasn't quick. He struggled for over 8 hours before taking his last breath. And I stayed the entire time because I was the one who made the decision. I had no brothers, sisters, aunts, uncles, or cousins. My mother had already passed away. It was just me and my dad, and in that moment, when he was gone, I felt the loneliest I had ever felt in my life. I still hope he can forgive me for the choice I had to make. I was 25 at the time, and to this day, the holidays are difficult. Sometimes I even feel jealous of people who still have their families to spend them with, even though I know I shouldn't. Story 35. A few years ago, I was in Guatemala on a humanitarian mission with my medevac company, providing support to engineering and medical units, building schools, and hosting clinics. At the end of the mission, we arranged for some of the top-performing service members to get a short helicopter ride, either a quick trip up and down the rescue hoist or a short flight to view their work from the air. After finishing the hoist portion, we dropped off our Army photographer and loaded several passengers for an open-door tour flight. While my buddy Ken and I secured the passengers, the photographer asked another crew member on the ground if he could stand in front of the aircraft to film our takeoff. Unfortunately, no one realized the danger. As we lifted off from the soccer field, a dead tree limb, loosened by our rotor wash, fell and struck the photographer, breaking his neck. Within a minute of takeoff, our ops team called over the radio, breathless, requesting an urgent medevac. We turned back immediately. Ken rushed to find medical gear from another aircraft while we returned to pick up the injured man. Less than 20 minutes earlier, he had been completely fine, riding with us in the helicopter. We loaded him and flew to Guatemala City, performing CPR in flight, but he was pronounced dead at the hospital. It was the first time I had lost a patient and the first time I had performed CPR in a real emergency. The incident grounded our crews for several months during the investigation. I will never forget saluting his coffin as it was loaded onto a C-130 to return him home. Everyone involved in the mission was deeply affected, but we leaned on each other and our grief counselors. As tragic as it was, the experience prepared me for future deployments. I know I can never bring him back, but I hope to honor his memory by continuing to serve and bringing others home alive. Story 36. Two of my close friends were heading back from a day of boating at dusk. The driver had a few drinks throughout the day, but not enough to make him unfit to operate the boat. The passenger had also had a few, and about a mile from the harbor and roughly 200 feet from shore, the steering linkage suddenly snapped while they were going about 30 miles per hour. The 18-foot boat veered sharply, throwing both of them into the water. The boat continued circling at full throttle. They both survived the initial fall, but on its next pass, the boat struck the passenger, and he was not seen again. I worked for the fire department that responded to the scene, and I was also a rescue diver. We searched for days without success, and I even went out on my own time to look for him. 2 weeks later, a snorkeler found his remains, and I happened to be on duty. When we arrived, I made the decision to look down and see him, despite my coworkers advising against it. His body had been heavily damaged by marine life and was mostly skeletal, identifiable only by his bathing suit. The image still haunts me to this day. I later left that department for another in a different town. Even 6 years later, the memory remains vivid. At the time, I thought I was tough enough to skip the post-incident stress debriefing, but looking back, I wish I had attended. I still blame myself for not finding him right away. I know the boat strike likely caused fatal injuries instantly, but I can't shake the feeling that I failed him and his family by not recovering him sooner. Story 37. In 2010, when I was around 12, I traveled from Sweden to my homeland, Syria, for a summer vacation with my mother. We spent the first month together and were expecting my sister to join us from Sweden in August. On the day she was arriving, my mother and I were visiting a friend of hers, a man in his 30s who offered to drive us to the airport. That night, while driving along the highway, a woman dressed entirely in black suddenly stepped onto the road. The driver had no time to react and struck her. She was thrown across the highway and part of her clothing got caught on the windshield as glass shattered over the driver and my mother. The driver quickly pulled off at a slip road, arranged a taxi for us, and tried to calm us down. About a week later, I was told she had died, though initially they had said she was alive. Years later, I learned from my mother that her friend, the man who had driven us that night, was later killed in a brutal and unjust manner by corrupt authorities a week after the accident. He was accused of something related to her death, though it clearly wasn't murder. I believe it was more likely that he took his own life after what happened. Learning this filled me with deep guilt. I kept thinking that if we hadn't taken that trip, neither he nor the woman would have died. Over time, I've come to accept that fate was out of my control, but the thought still aches. 2 innocent people lost their lives in connection to something as simple as us going to pick up my sister from the airport. Story 38. Although I didn't take someone's life intentionally, my slow reaction and lack of decisive action led to a stranger's child losing hers. While living abroad, I saw a little girl wandering into a busy road. I later learned her mother had been distracted by another child, though I didn't know that at the time. I remember trying to push the girl out of the way of an oncoming car, but I didn't push her hard enough. We were both struck. She later died in the hospital while I survived with spinal injuries. Her mother understandably blamed me, though I barely remember what she said in that moment. I replay that day constantly, even 7 years later. I think about every possible alternative. What if I had pulled her instead of pushing? What if I had tried to shield her? What if I had done nothing? That day changed my life. I broke up with my girlfriend, my health declined, and I distanced myself from my already strained family. The guilt has been overwhelming, and I can honestly say that if not for the support of my current partner, I might not be here today. Story 39. I doubt many will see this, but here it is. My mother and I always had an extremely unhealthy relationship. She struggled with multiple mental health issues and substance abuse. While there were times when her symptoms were under control, she was never able to get the help she truly needed to become stable. During my high school years, she became completely dependent on me, not only to help with her declining physical health, but also to be her sole emotional support, as she had distanced herself from nearly everyone else in her life. Over time, it became clear that our relationship had shifted from parent-child to something more like adult caretaker. Without my support, I knew she would consider ending her life. This created a situation where I could never be fully honest with her for fear of triggering an extreme reaction, which happened often. Last year, when I came home for the holidays, Our relationship was worse than it had ever been. We ended up in a shouting match, our first ever full-blown argument, where she said she was going to take her own life. This time I didn't beg her not to. I knew she would see my silence as permission, but I was exhausted. I couldn't keep being her only reason to live. She called the next day to apologize, but I didn't forgive her, unlike in the past when I always did. 2 days later, my father called to tell me she had made an attempt, but survived and was in the hospital. A further complication left her with only minimal awareness. She could still see and hear, but could not comprehend, move, or communicate. She didn't recognize me anymore. I was part of the decision to remove her from life support. In a way, I felt like I had lost her twice. Once when I stopped being her lifeline, and again when I agreed to end her medical care. I still struggle with the thought that, by my actions and inactions, I denied her any chance of recovery. Story 40. I was 11 years old and my grandpa, my hero, had recently suffered a heart attack. He had been the English table tennis coach, a man full of energy, humor, and love for life. Every day with him brought new memories, whether he was teasing me, encouraging me, or sharing stories. I adored him, and he made me feel special. That day, my mother and grandmother brought him from his bed to his favorite chair and left me with him while we watched snooker on TV. He seemed tired but stable. We chatted as we often did, just enjoying each other's company. Then it happened. He began shaking violently. He reached toward me with his left arm, his eyes filled with both fear and hope. I froze. I thought for a moment that he was joking, as he often did. I told him it wasn't funny and to stop pretending. I repeated myself, still unmoving, as his arm dropped and he stared straight ahead. The shaking slowed. Only then did I start screaming for my mom. She and my grandmother rushed in, but by then he was unresponsive, though still alive. My mother immediately called for an ambulance. I've never stopped thinking about the fact that my grandpa faced that moment without me holding his hand, without his wife or daughter by his side, just me sitting there, unable to act. I didn't even pick up the phone that was right in front of me. You hear stories of kids saving lives with quick thinking, but that wasn't me. What I didn't do that day has stayed with me, shaping how I see myself. I don't think I'll ever truly forgive myself. Story 41. On July 3, 2012, in Khost Province, Afghanistan, I was 18 years old on patrol in what was considered a safe village. Our guard was down because we weren't expecting enemy presence. But suddenly I found myself within 20 feet of a boy holding a weapon and pointing it at me. He was about 15 years old with wide eyes and a frozen expression. By all rights, he had the advantage and could have ended my life. Instead, I reacted first. I fired and he fell. He cried out, and I could see he was in severe pain. Later, going through his belongings, I realized he had likely been coerced, given a small payment and a cheap watch to attack the first Americans he saw, then run away. He didn't run. He might have been too scared or conflicted, and it cost him his life. He had an awkward teenage mustache, the kind my friends and I had at that age. He looked like someone I could have known back home. In that moment, it hit me that I had killed someone who might have surrendered. He was the only one there. No other fighters in sight. I received a medal for that day, but it is a memory I carry heavily. I've been in situations where I know I was responsible for taking lives, but this one haunts me the most. I've accepted that I will never fully move past it, because I can't imagine the kind of person who could simply live with something like that. Story 42. In high school, I had a heavily modified Subaru WRX that could really fly. On Saturday nights, we'd race along the countryside. Growing up in West Virginia meant a lot of narrow, winding rural roads carved into hillsides, with sharp drops on one side and rock faces on the other. One night, I was racing a friend for $100. A lot of money for us at the time. He had his girlfriend in his car, and I had my girlfriend in mine. We were going around 60 miles per hour on a road barely wide enough for two cars, with a steep drop to a creek on one side. I was just behind him when we rounded a blind curve and saw a deer in my lane. I swerved, braking hard, and clipped the side of his car. His vehicle hit the rock face, bounced through the guardrail, and landed upside down in the creek bed. I lost control, spinning into the rock face myself, which left me with broken ribs and left my girlfriend injured. I was unconscious until friends pulled us from the car because of a fuel leak. When I came to, I saw emergency responders working below, but then everything went black again, and I woke up 3 weeks later in the hospital. Tragically, the crash and its aftermath claimed several lives, including my friend, his passenger, and others who had tried to help. My girlfriend left soon after, and I faced legal consequences. I was cleared of serious charges, but lost my license for 2 years. My memory of that time is hazy, and I didn't fully process it until much later in college. I still love cars and racing, but only on legal tracks now. The road where it happened is closed to the public, but sometimes I go back, sit quietly, and reflect on everything that changed that night. Story 43. When I was 16, my parents went on vacation to Europe. My dad was a surgeon, and my mom worked in accounting for a university, so we had a large home compared to others in our area. Because of that, my dad warned me to be careful and even had me keep a secured 12-gauge shotgun in my room for emergencies. A few days after they left, I was about to go to bed when I heard glass breaking downstairs. From the sound, I knew someone had entered through the breezeway window. I grabbed the shotgun and quietly went down the stairs. I heard the intruder moving around in my dad's office. I waited near the kitchen, keeping the doorway in sight. When he came out, he was holding what looked like a rifle and saw me in the dark. As soon as he started to raise it, I fired. He went down instantly. I realized afterward that a bullet had hit the stone pillar where my head would have been if I'd been standing differently. I called the police and they arrived quickly. The situation was ruled as self-defense. While it was the first time I had ever been in such a life-threatening situation, I've always been able to process things in a very direct way. I don't have nightmares about it, but I know how close I came to not walking away that night. I just hope I never have to face anything like it again. Story 44. When I was 18, I came back from college to host an awards banquet for a local Boy Scout group. I was driving along a mixed-use highway, speed limit 45 miles per hour, but with plenty of businesses and side streets, on my way to pick up my +1. Without warning, a driver ignored a stop sign and pulled out directly in front of me. I hit his car at about 40 miles per hour, and my truck's grill became lodged in the side of his vehicle. We spun sideways, and the car behind me, which had been tailgating, struck my driver's side. Disoriented from the airbag, I crawled out through the passenger door, still in my uniform, and instinctively offered to help anyone injured. That's when the driver who had been tailgating confronted me angrily, insisting the accident was my fault. He was much larger than me and looked ready to start a fight. Thankfully, an off-duty EMT stepped in, keeping him back until the police arrived. The man who ran the stop sign did not survive, and his grandchildren, who were in the car, were taken to the hospital along with their mother, who had been injured. The most heartbreaking moment was seeing his wife, who was in the early stages of dementia, not fully understanding what had happened. The whole experience felt surreal, as though I were watching it rather than living it. I didn't feel guilt, but I did learn something important. Safe driving isn't just about protecting yourself. It's about preventing the people who love you from experiencing that kind of loss. Story 45. When I was a teenager, my stepmother, who had been married to my dad since I was 4, developed Alzheimer's disease. We didn't always get along, but she was the closest thing I had to a mother figure, and I cared about her. My dad took care of her at home for years, but eventually the toll on his own health became too great, and she was moved into a nursing home. Long before her illness, she had told my dad she never wanted her life prolonged if she reached that stage, having seen both her parents suffer from the same condition. At first, she made it very clear she didn't want to be there, and often lashed out at staff and other residents. One day, after an especially serious incident, my dad called me to talk about her wishes. He asked how I felt about stopping her medication so she could pass naturally. I agreed, as did my siblings. After that, her condition worsened, and the staff struggled with her increasing agitation. Then my dad called to tell me she had suffered a massive stroke. Because of her advance directive, they provided only comfort care. I lived over 1,000 miles away, and my dad asked me not to come until it was over, saying it was very difficult to watch. Even though I know it was what she wanted and that we honored her wishes, I still carry a sense of guilt about it. My dad once admitted he felt the same. It's something I've made peace with intellectually, but emotionally it still lingers.